Right then, I think we'll just get started at 7 o'clock. Hi, welcome everyone to the Middle East Quantity Surveyors Association presentation on procurement and tendering. I'm Graham Hill. Just to introduce myself. I've been a quantity surveyor for almost 30 years actually. I'm an associate director with David Adamson Partners based in Qatar. I currently lead the pre-contract team with the David Adamson and Partners. I've been in Qatar office for almost 9 years, and previously I was in the David Adamson office in the UK. Right, we're going to talk about procurement and tendering now. This is one of the key sort of bits of knowledge that you must need for the RICS APC exams. As you know, there's level 1, 2 and 3 requirements. So I'm going to run through them. We're going to take the presentation from the headings which are within our RICS APC reading list, which are listed here: the types of procurement, financial basis, tendering, partnering. And then I'm going to run through a fairly broad selection of the type of questions that you can expect to get in the APC, and I'll try and give some outline answers as well. Okay. Right, the description of the competency, procurement and tendering. In the context of the construction sector, the competency covers how a project is structured and delivered in terms of risk allocation and contractual relationships, and how tendering processes are used to establish a contract price. Candidates should have a clear understanding of the different types of procurement and tendering commonly used, and advantages and disadvantages of each. They should have a detailed working knowledge of the procurement routes and tendering processes used on their projects. We're going to run through the level 1, 2 and 3 requirements for this particular discipline. Level 1, you must demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the main types of procurement used in both public and private sector. You must know about the tendering and negotiating process, and ancillary processes such as partnering and framework agreements, and also the codes of practice and procedures commonly used. For level 2, you should be able to apply your knowledge in implementing procurement routes, such as traditional design and build, management contracting, producing and or compiling tender documentation such as letter of invitation, form of tender, health and safety documentation, design documentation and contractual details. Please note, pricing documents are covered under the quantification and cost and construction work, so they won't be discussed today. And also carrying out tendering and negotiation processes, such as single and two-stage tendering, and the use of codes of practice and electronic tendering. For level 3, you should be able to advise on evaluating the appropriateness of various procurement routes, managing and tendering and negotiating process, and preparing procurement and tendering reports. There's an RICS APC reading list. I'm not going to list everything here. It's all listed in the pathway guides, which I'm sure you all have access to. But the main headings are the types of procurement, the financial basis, tendering and partnering, and that's what I'm going to be dealing with in this presentation. So what is procurement? Well, procurement is a process which creates, manages and fulfills contracts. Now, it's important to know this because I remember when I sat on EPC, one of the questions was, what is procurement? Everyone knows what it is, but it's difficult to explain. So I would suggest that if you are sitting your EPC, you memorise a good description of what procurement is, because it is a question that could come up. Procurement can, and as such, be described as a succession of logically related actions occurring or performed in a definite manner, and which culminate in the completion of a major deliverable or the attainment of a milestone. Processes, in turn, are underpinned by methods, i.e. a documented, systematically ordered collection of rules or approaches and procedures, which are informed and shaped by the policy of an employer. Methods and procedures can likewise be documented and linked to processes. Procurement activities commence once the need for procurement is identified and end when the transaction is completed. Now, today we're going to discuss the various 4 main types of procurement. There is other types, but these are the 4 main ones, and you should certainly should have a good knowledge of these 4. The traditional procurement, where the client engages in the design team and the contractor direct. Design and build, where the client engages a contractor who then employs designers. Management contracting, where the contractor performs the role of managing the works contractors who carry out works. And construction management, where the construction manager is employed to arrange trade contracts and monitor them. So we'll deal with traditional procurement first. The contractor relationship. The client employs a design team to design the project. The client then appoints a contractor to construct the project. Subcontractors are contracted to the main contractor. When is it used? Traditional procurement is used on a broad range of building types. The emphasis is cost and quality. The design is completed before the construction starts, so the time taken overall is longer. The process. The client appoints a design team to complete the full design for the building. Now, this is important. In some forms of construction, such as fast track, design and build, management contracting, the project can start on site before the design is complete, which causes risk, obviously. If the client is wanting the construction amount to be fixed, it means that the design has got to be fixed before it hits the site. So ideally, the design will be completed, and then and only then will the quantity surveyor prepare the bills of quantities, and the project will then be tendered based on a bill of quantities that is based on a completed design. The project is tendered to a number of contractors, and the lowest tender is normally appointed. Not always, normally. Specialist works are tendered during construction, i.e. in glazing or cladding, and that can be done by a nominated subcontractor. The contractor is responsible for the programme. The advantages of traditional procurement are as follows. The client has full design that he has already approved. The client can make changes on site, and they can use the bill of quantities for assessing costs of these changes. Early cost certainty is a possibility, which is rare in construction, and there's a fairly even split of financial risk. Standard forms of contracts are widely used, can be the FIDIC Red Book. If you're in the UK, it can be the JCT standard form. There's various types of contract, and most clients and contractors and professionals are familiar with these contracts. Disadvantages. The overall procurement time is slower. Quite often, especially in Qatar, UAE, whatever, the client is always keen to start work on site soon. So sometimes this is a bit too slow for them. The domestic subcontractors are not tendered individually, so there's a lack of visibility. It's up to the main contractor to do his own procurement of subcontractors, and it's difficult for the client to find out how that's done. The contractor's expertise is not used in the design, so sometimes buildability can be an issue. The contractor's relationship creates sides, so there's potential for adversarial attitudes. The design has to be fully complete before tendering can take place. The key risks for the client: the actual amount of cost is fixed. Inflation is built into the rates, but there's still the risk of cost increases due to the quantities changing. Design function and construction function are split, so there's no single point of responsibility. PC sums may be inadequate. The quantity surveyor should come up with prime cost sums based on the specification for certain items, but also some provisional sums if required. Is usually at some risk, so the risk of cost increases further down the line. The design team may lack irrelevant experience, hopefully not, if they've been chosen properly. If the client continues to request changes to the brief, there's a risk of cost and programme overruns. Basically, on any form of procurement, it's always good not to make changes once it's signed, but it always happens. How to mitigate the risks. due diligence on bill of quantities and design to see what percentage of costs are actually fixed and at what stage of design that is at. There's a need for individual warranties of all parties. It's very important. The QS should carry out the cost checks on PC sums with the proposed design. If there is any issues, it should be flagged up as soon as possible, so saving can perhaps be made elsewhere. You can increase the professional indemnity or change the consultant or subcontractor if there's specific concerns. You can change a consultant or add a further consultant to assist, perhaps for a specialised part of the project. You can add an approval procedure to the facility agreement so that changes are flagged early and subject to approval. It's quite difficult to do this under standard forms of contract, but under some partnering such as NEC, there's early warning system which can work quite well. Any changes are costed before they're approved, and they're usually costed within 14 days. We'll then go on to design and build procurement, which is becoming more and more common in this part of the world. The contractual relationship. The client issues a set of requirements for the building that he requires to the contractor in the form of employer's requirements. They should be as detailed as they can be with some sort of performance specification. The contractor then makes a proposal based on the requirements, including design, specification and price. The contract is awarded based on these criteria. A D&B is usually used on buildings with simple design like warehousing or some repetitive housing. It's something that doesn't have to be a high level of specification, that is reasonably simple to design and build. The emphasis in this form of procurement is the time and the cost. Design and construction are overlapped, so the overall project duration is shorter. The process. The client appoints a design team to develop the client brief, i.e. the type and size of the building that is required to suit their needs. The client tenders to a number of design and build contractors, and the contractor is selected on overall tender, which includes the design, the programme and the works. The contractor then builds the building and completes it to programme. Now that all sounds very simple, but in actual fact, the client team, they should have some consultant on board who looks at the design and specification suggested by the contractor very carefully to make sure that it does meet the employer's requirements. After the contract is let, it's too late. You've got to tie this down before you let the contract and make sure that the contractor is actually delivering what is required. An advantage of D&B is that the client is a single point of responsibility for the design and the construction. And the contractor's expertise is used in the design. Early cost centrality is possible, and design and construction are overlapped and so quicker. The disadvantages of D&B. The client relinquishes control over design, quality may suffer. Some clients find this difficult to understand. They are sold on D&B as the transfer of risk from themselves onto the contractor, and that the contractor accepts all risk, including underground risks, but he must understand that he relinquishes control over design. He's not fully in control of it. You can't have full design control and also lose all the risk over to the contractor. That's not how it works. The client changes are difficult after the contract is started. They can be very expensive. Client's requirements must be clear and comprehensive. That's key. The client should take guidance from an expert when they're compiling the employer's requirements so they're tied down very clearly. Changes are very expensive post-contract. Key risks for the client. The end result may be not what the client wanted. Again, this can be mitigated if the design is tied down, employment's requirements are clear, and the correct contractors and their design are chosen. And the D&B contractor may not be set up properly with PFI insurance for design. Obviously, that's due diligence at the start, and that's got to be checked. Contractors and in-house designers may have a lack of track record of the type of design required. Again, due diligence, that should be checked out before they're appointed. If D&B is used on a bespoke design rather than a simple design, the client will have no control of the design. That's what we spoke about. If the D&B route is proposed but not reflected in the contracts and the roles and responsibilities are not clear, there's a risk of cost increases and disputes. Again, due diligence when forming a contract. How to mitigate these risks. Should examine the client's and employer's requirements and the contractual proposals at the outset. Basically, should match up together. Every clause from the employer's requirement should be matched with the contractual proposal. Should obtain access to the actual designers via warranties and a PI cover. This is very important if anything goes wrong. You need that direct link. You should carry out a design due diligence and architectural structural review. An experienced architect should be appointed by the client to review the design proposed by the contractor. Should carry out legal due diligence on the contracts and contractual arrangement between the parties, specialist legal advice. Now we're going on to management contracting. This is not as common, but it is important, and there's a good chance that this will be asked in the APC. The contractual relationship. The client employs a design team to design the building and a managing contractor on a fixed percentage fee to manage the subcontracts. The management contractor is brought on board early to advise on the design also. The subcontractors are all appointed by the design team and enter into contracts with the management contractor. When is this used? It's used on unique specialist buildings or where time is critical. The client is normally very experienced in this type of development. In fact, if he's not experienced, I would strongly advise not to use management contractor. And the emphasis in this firm procurement is time. The design and construction overlap so that overall project duration is shorter. The process is as follows. The client appoints a design team to design the building and then the management contractor on the percentage fee to advise design and buildability. The first packages are designed and tendered and then start on site. The design on the next subcontractor then commence and are appointed in time to continue the work. So it's a continuous process of appointing the contractors just in time to start their package. Design and construction are overlapped all the way through the project up until completion. Advantages, design and construction overlap, so the whole process is quicker. Each subcontract is tendered individually, ensuring full competitiveness. The management contractor's experience is used in the design. Specialist subcontractor's experience is also used in the design, which is very useful if it's a specialist type of building project. Management contractor is responsible for delivering the project on programme. Disadvantages. Costs are not fixed at the outset. It needs a QS on board right at the start to continuously monitor costs, continuously report. There's potential for conflict between the subcontractors, e.g. in this instance, if one delays the other, there's going to be an issue. The client's involvement is very high, a high degree of interface and programming. When we say the client, obviously the client can employ their specialist team to do it. The client assumes a high level of time and design risk. The costs are not fixed at the outset. Typically only 20 to 40% of costs can be tendered at the start and fixed at the start on site. And also the design is not complete at the outset. The management contractor simply is not responsible for problems with subcontractors, and the risk of the cost increases are borne by the client. There may be a lack of PI cover on subcontractors. Again, due diligence, and that should all be checked out at the start or as soon as possible as the subcontractors come on board. The management contractor is not responsible for design defects due to subcontractors. How to mitigate these risks? You can add an additional design contingency to the budget to cover any increases and carry out design due diligence. can amend a contract so the management contractor is responsible for the programme. Any disputes between subcontractors, workmanship and cost increase due to insolvency. Now, this will obviously come at cost. If you're expecting the contractor to take on his responsibilities, he'll obviously going to charge for that. It could be money well spent though. For PI, advisors should insist on moving some subcontractors into the main contractor's responsibility and increase PI cover from the management contractor. How to mitigate the risks. Add an additional design contingency to the budget to cover any increases, carry out design due diligence, amend a contract, as we discussed. So the contractor is responsible for the programme disputes. For PI, advisors should insist on moving subcontractors into the main contractor's responsibility and ensure that a system of PI cover with warranties is in place to the satisfaction of the legal advisors. Construction management. Now, this is where some people get confused between construction management and management construction. I'm going to try and explain, well, obviously I've explained what management construction is. I'm now going to explain what construction management is. Be careful not to get them mixed up. The client employs a design team to design the building and the construction manager on a fixed percentage fee to manage the subcontractors. It differs from management contracting in that the construction manager does not hold contracts with the subcontractors. They are direct to the client. That's probably the key difference. Mainly used by US companies, the emphasis in this form of procurement is time. The design and construction are overlapped, so overall project duration is shorter. Process. The client appoints a design team to design the building, and then a construction manager on a percentage or lump sum fee to manage the subcontractors. The first packages are designed and tendered and start on site. Design on the next subcontract commence and are appointed in time to continue the works. Design construction overlapped. Again, all similar to management contracting. Advantages. Design construction overlap and they're so quicker. Specialist subcontractors' experience is used in the design. Each subcontract is tendered individually, so it's a very competitive way of working. Disadvantages. Costs are not fixed at the outset. No single point of responsibility. Client assumes a high level of time, cost and design. Client involvement is high. There's a high degree of interface and programming required between the design and the construction. The key risks for the client. Costs are not fixed at the outset. Again, typically only 20 to 40% of costs are tendered and fixed at start. Design is not complete at the outset. The construction manager is not liable for the programme delay, i.e. only damages. So the risk of delays and cost increases are borne by the client. There's a lack of PI cover on the subcontractors. The construction manager is not responsible for design defects due to subcontractors. How to mitigate these risks. You can add an additional design contingency to the budget to cover for any increases, and you must carry out design due diligence. Convert appointment to construction management with the risk of a programme overrun. This is difficult to do, as the construction manager is usually a consultant. For PI, advisors should insist on moving some subcontractors into the main contractor's responsibility and increased PI cover from management contractor. Should ensure that a system of PI cover along with warranties is in place to the satisfaction of the legal advisors. Also consider a blanket PI policy for the entire project. So that's the 4 general forms of procurement that we're going to deal with. We're now going on to the financial basis for these different types of procurement. Again, this is key study material. There's every chance that you will get asked at the APC for some of these, if not all of them. So make sure that you read up. Lump sum. A lump sum contract is a traditional means of procuring construction, It's still the most common form of construction contract. Under lump sum, a single lump sum for all works is agreed before the works begin. If you're asked for a definition, it's a fixed price contract where contractors undertake to be responsible for executing the complete contract work for a stated total sum of money. This is generally appropriate where the project is well defined, when tenders are sought, and significant changes. Hang on, technical issues. Don't know if you can hear me. Significant changes to requirements are unlikely. And this means the contractor is able to accurately price the works they've been asked to carry out. Some technical issues. I'm so sorry, I'm on some technical issues. I think I'm getting some speed coming through. Just a minute, please. Hi, sorry about that. Had some technical issues there. I think somebody else's feed. Lump sum contracts might be less appropriate where speed is important or where the nature of works is not well defined. Other forms of contract that might be more appropriate in such circumstances include measurement contracts, which are used where the works can be described in reasonable detail but the amount cannot. Cost reimbursement contracts, which are used where the nature of the works cannot be properly defined at the outset, often used where an immediate start on site is required. Target cost contracts and so on, and I'll be dealing with them soon. Lump sum contracts apportion more risk to the contractor than some other forms of contract, as there are fewer mechanisms to allow them to vary their price, and they give the client some certainty about the likely cost of the works. The tender process will tend to be slower than for other forms of contract, and preparing a tender may be more expensive for the contractor. A lump sum contract, it does not give all the project risk to the contractor. It's not a fixed price. It's not a guaranteed maximum price. The price of a lump sum contract can change. And I'm now going to list some of the mechanisms that can vary the contract sum. Variations. These are changes in the nature of the works. And most contracts will contain provision for the architect or contract administrator to issue instructions to vary the design, the quantities, the quality, sequence, or working conditions. Relevant events. A relevant event may be caused by the client, for example, failure to supply goods or instructions, or maybe a neutral event, such as exceptional adverse weather, and may result in a claim for loss and expense by the contractor. Provisional sums. An allowance for a specific element of the works that's not defined in enough detail for tenderers to price. Obviously, the provisional sum may or may not be enough to cover that work. It's an educated estimate carried out by a quantity surveyor at the start of the contract, but obviously there's still some risk. Fluctuations. Fluctuations are a mechanism for dealing with inflation on projects that may last for several years, where the contractor's tenders are based on current prices. Then the contract makes provisions for the contractor to be reimbursed for price changes over the duration of the project. Payments of nominated subcontractors or nominated suppliers, statutory fees, and payments relating to opening up of works for inspection and testing. Basically, the better defined the works are when the contract is agreed, the less likely it is that the contract sum will change. It's important to recognise that a truly fixed price contract would not necessarily be in the interest of the client, as it would require that the contractor prices all risks over which they may have no control and which might not arise. So it would end up with a higher tender price, and also give very little scope for the client to alter their requirements. Advantages of lump sum contracts. Client's risk is minimal. Still risk, but minimal. Fewer variations. The client can arrange capital according to the payment plan. The contractor's cash flow is predictable, and the tendering process is transparent and impartial. The disadvantages of lump sum contracts. Contractor's risk is high. Could be poor productivity, and mismanagement can lead to the project into a loss. Poor details and specifications in the design can lead to project disputes. Delays in the client's financing can delay the project. Design should be complete and available before the pre-contract process, and procurement times can be long. Now going on to measurement contracts. Measurement contracts can be used in situations where the design can be described in reasonable detail, where the design or type of works can be described, but the amount cannot. For example, excavation works where the quantity of excavation required is difficult to assess until after the works have begun, or refurbishment where there are some uncertainties about the works that will be required. A measurement contract might also be appropriate on projects where the design has not been completed in sufficient detail for bills of quantities to be produced. It should be possible to describe the works in sufficient detail to determine a programme and to obtain rates from tenderers. And generally, tenders' rates will be based on drawings and approximate quantities. The actual contract sum, which is sometimes called the ascertained final sum, cannot be determined when the contract is entered into. That's calculated on completion based on the remeasurement of the actual work carried out and the rates tendered. Instead of giving a firm price, rates are provided in the contractor's tender, either as part of the priced approximate bill of quantities or within a schedule of rates. Then the actual quantities of work carried out are measured and the tendered rates are applied to those quantities. The contractor is paid for the actual work that they have done. As a result, the quantities paid for may vary from the original estimate. Measurement contracts can allow an early start on site before design is complete, and they can allow changes to be made to the works relatively easily. However, there is inevitably some risk for the client as the cost of the works is not known. In effect, the client is taking a risk for any unknowns, and while this can result in the competitive prices from contractors, the level of uncertainty for the client means that measurement contracts are rare, other than on large civil engineering contracts. I'm going to talk about the cost reimbursable contract. Cost reimbursable contract, sometimes called cost plus contract, is one in which the contractor is reimbursed for the actual costs that they incur in carrying out the works, plus an additional fee. Examples are option E of the NEC engineering construction contract. That's a good example of a cost reimbursable contract that works really well. There's also other forms. You can do it under FIDIC. A cost reimbursable contract might be used where the nature or scope of the work to be carried out cannot properly be defined at the outset, and the risks associated with the works are high, such as emergency work. For example, urgent alteration or repair work, if there's been a building failure or a fire which requires immediate reconstruction. It could be a building's gone on fire and the client wants to retain the building, but perhaps it's in danger of falling down. So you need to get somebody on site very quickly to start making it good. Obviously, full records will have to be kept right from day one. The tendering may proceed based on an outline specification, any drawings available, and an estimate of the costs. It's a high risk form of contracting for the client that has no idea of the final cost when the contract is entered into, in that there's no contract sum. The cost for which a contractor is entitled to be reimbursed must be set out very clearly in the contract. It's a complex procedure, it needs to be carefully considered, as while some direct costs may be relatively straightforward to determine, others shared costs might not be. The direct costs that are clearly attributable to a single project could include, for instance, the labour, materials, hired plant, and subcontractors. The other costs that might be spread over more than one project could be head office costs, staff costs, the manufacturing facilities, and owned plant. So these costs might be calculated on a pro rata basis and charged along with profits as a pre-agreed lump sum or percentage fee. In order that the contractor may contain their cash flow, cost reimbursable contracts may also allow them to charge for liabilities or for costs that will be incurred before the next interim payment. The costs are calculated based on the contractor's accounts and other records which are made available to the client on an open book basis. Now, this can be an issue because the only way that the cost can be accurately valued is if it's a full open book basis. Many contractors are not particularly keen to open up their books to the QS, but it's the only way they're going to get paid everything that they think they're due. So difficult. The client may also monitor activities on site to verify that the costs are legitimate. For example, checking whether plant is being charged is actually being used and that costs are not excessive. This can become complex where the contractor is thought to be operating inefficiently or incompetently. It requires a great deal of supervision by the client team. The contractor can be incentivized to operate efficiently by the introduction of a target cost. Here, the target cost is agreed at the beginning of the project. At the end of the project, the actual cost is compared to the target cost, taking into account any changes that have been agreed. So the target cost, if there's any variations, the target cost will go up or go down, depending on the variation. If the actual cost is lower than the target cost, the savings can be shared between the parties to the contract on a pre-agreed basis, often a percentage. If the actual cost is higher than the target cost, the additional cost may also be shared, but possibly only up to a guaranteed maximum price, in which case, if the price goes above the guaranteed maximum price, the client is, the contractor is liable for all costs over this figure. Target costs. Target costs are generally associated with cost reimbursable contracts. They introduce a mechanism which enables the contractor and the consultant team sometimes to share in the benefits of cost savings, but also bear some of the client's costs when there are cost overruns. Contracting the contractor and the consultant team on a target cost basis can be an effective way of ensuring good collaboration. The target cost is set early in the project, and then cost savings or overruns are shared based on the agreed formula. The aim is to provide financial incentive encouraging the cost control rather than to penalise them. Bonus and penalty payments are usually capped to prevent overzealous or adversarial behaviour. Target costs might be set for the overall project or for specific elements of the works. Agreeing the target cost requires that the client has sufficient knowledge and experience to be able to accurately estimate the likely cost of the works and to negotiate effectively with the contractor and sometimes the consultant team. Examples of target cost contracts are the NEC engineering and construction contracts option C. It is a target contract with activity schedule, and there's also option D, which is a target contract with bill of quantities. So that completes the presentation on procurement, and we're now going to go into the second part, which is tendering. What is tendering? Again, sounds a simple question, but it's the sort of question that they may ask you as an opening question in the APC. It can be defined as a submission made by a prospective supplier in response to an invitation to tender, commonly known as ITT. It makes an offer for the supply of goods or services. An invitation to tender might be issued for a range of contracts, including equipment supply, main construction contract, perhaps including design by the contractor, demolition, enabling works, etc. An invitation to tender, that's the first part of the process. An invitation to tender may follow the completion of a pre-qualification questionnaire called the PQQ in response to an advert posted by the client and perhaps a pre-tender interview. The purpose of the pre-qualification questionnaire and pre-tender interview is to enable the client to produce a short list of suppliers that are likely to be most appropriate for their particular project, who will then be invited to tender. The content of an invitation to tender, it could vary, but this is sort of common headings that you'd expect to see. There'll be a letter of invitation to tender, the form of tender, the preliminaries, which will include the pre-construction information and perhaps a site waste management plan. Also, health and safety is quite important nowadays and will probably be asked for. The form of contract, contract conditions and amendments. This might include a model enabling amendment if the building information model, the BIM, is being used to make a BIM protocol part of the contract documentation. Employers' information requirements if BIM is used. a tender pricing document, or contract sum analysis on design and build projects. So usually that's a bill of quantities. A drawing schedule, and the design drawings, perhaps existing building information model and the specification. Apart from perhaps the BIM part of it, and the rest of these are the sort of bare minimum that you'd expect an invitation to tender, if you're expecting the contractors to be able to accurately price the project and give a bona fide tender. Right, so once the tender has been issued to the contractor, and then obviously the contractor has to take some time to go through the whole tender documentation, to go through the drawings, to go through the bill of quantities. He'll send it out to his subcontract and the chosen subcontractors basically, and they'll come back with queries to the main contractor. Especially on larger projects, there'll be the tender clarifications, which is when the contractor raises a question back to the client team, and they may hold the mid-tender interviews. Now this the intention of the mid-tender interview is that the contractors had some time to look at the tender, and they may have some common questions, or maybe the client just wants to clarify some of the aspects of the project. And the whole point is to lead to an accurate tender being submitted. There's not much point if the contractors don't understand what they've been asked to price. So it's in everyone's interest to make sure everyone's got the best information possible. The responses to queries raised during the tender process can lead to clarification or amendment of the tender documentation, which may also result in extension of the tender period. Now, very common for the tender period to be extended. Usually what happens in practice is that there's a time set for the tendering. It's usually less than is probably what is required, but it's to focus the contractor basically. So he doesn't leave it to the last minute, he focuses them at the start, and then quite often the client, if he's asked to buy the tender, contractors will extend it by 2 weeks, 3 weeks, just to give them more time to get the full prices in from the subcontractors. It's important any clarification or additional information or changes to the tender documents are circulated to all of the tenderers to ensure a level playing field. However, this should not give away particular suppliers' proposed methodology, commercial proposals, or programming advantages, which may have been divulged to the client consultants in interviews. Any such information must be treated as confidential. So the tendering submissions. In response to the invitation to tender, invited tenders will submit their tender, which will include their price for supplying the goods and services, along with proposals for how the client's requirements will be satisfied if these have been requested. The precise content of tenders will vary considerably, depending on the procurement route. However, here are some headings which may be included. Tender return slip, a completed tender pricing document, schedule of rates, initial construction phase plan, any design proposals or method statements that have been requested, programme, very important, procedures to be adopted, a demonstration of capability. This will be almost like a CV of their previous projects to demonstrate that they've worked on similar size of projects, complexity, the same type of project, and so they've got a proven track record. Key project personnel, which may require submission of CVs. Again, it's very important to make sure that the personnel being put forward are experienced and competent. The management organisation, the plant and labour resources and availability, prior experience, which we just talked about, and any references from previous clients. Now, it all seems there's a lot of work required by the contractor to put this together, but and they know that they have to produce this, so every project, so if they have this information to hand. Obviously every project is slightly different, but it's all common. So when they submit the tender, what happens if there's variant bids? Now, all contractors should submit a compliant bid, but sometimes the client will ask the contractor if he wants to submit a variant bid. Now, this would have to be looked at very carefully. It will usually be a cheaper bid than the compliant bid, but there's obviously a payoff in the quality of the specification might not be the same. So alternative or non-compliant proposal may be submitted if the tender believes that what they're proposing offers better value for money, but they would have to provide full information on what they were providing for that. Qualified tenders. Now, qualified tenders are tenders which include reservations or statements made to limit liabilities if that tender is given a contract. Settlement. Once a client has identified the preferred tender, they may hold a tender settlement meeting to enter into negotiations. Again, this is very common in the Middle East. In some parts of the world, the contractors submit their tender, and after it's been checked that it's compliant, that all the figures stack up, and they're appointed on that basis. In the Middle East, that never happens. There's always a period of negotiation. The client may call either the lowest or the lowest 2 or 3 in, have a meeting with them, ask them to reduce their price. So this may result in a further adjustment of the tender documents and a submission of a revised tender. Two-stage tendering. You will likely be asked this in APC again. You'll be asked the difference between a single-stage tendering and two-stage tendering. So two-stage tendering is used to allow the early appointment of a supplier or a contractor prior to the completion of all information required to enable them a fixed price. For instance, this could be to do the enabling works, especially if it's a large project. It enables them to start clearing the site, perhaps doing the foundations, whatever. In the first stage, a limited appointment is agreed, allowing the contractor or supplier to begin work. And in the second stage, a fixed price is negotiated for the contract. It can be used to appoint the main contractor early, or more commonly, as a mechanism for the early appointment of a specialist supplier, such as a cladding contractor, or if they're already above ground, or some earthworks contractor. A two-stage tender process may also be adopted on a design and build project, where the employer's requirements are not sufficiently well developed for the contractor to be able to calculate a realistic price. In this case, the contractor will tender a fee for designing the building, along with a schedule of rates that can be used to establish the construction price for the second stage tender. Pre-tender estimate. Pre-tender estimate is a final estimate of the likely cost of the works that are described in completed tender documents prepared to seek the tender offers from prospective suppliers and contractors. The pre-tender estimate itself is not included in the tender documents. What actually happens is when the final tender document is issued to the contractors, it's also provided to the project QS, who has already produced a bill of quantities. But when he's got the full drawings and the full bill of quantities and the full specifications, he basically prices a project himself based on his experience. He may go out to the market to get some costs, but he'll usually use tenders from similar projects and his own database, and he'll come up with what he regards as an accurate pre-tender estimate. This gives some comfort when the tender is returned that it's in the ballpark, basically. It provides a final comparison of the budget, and along with the cash flow estimate, enables the client to confirm that he has sufficient funds available before committing to seek the tenders. Also gives the basis for assessing and comparing tenders when they're returned. If the pre-tender estimate exceeds the approved budget, an explanation should be provided for the client to consider and he can issue instructions. The pre-tender estimate should be prepared using a standard approach, for instance, in euros of measurement, but basically it should be based on the tender bill of quantities. So he's pricing the same information as the contractor's got. Obviously, the contractor, slightly different exercise. He's gone out to his full supply chain and getting exact prices, whereas the pre-tender estimate is based on the database that the quantity surveyor holds. According to the RICS NRM2, a detailed measurement for building works, a post-tender estimate, post-tender as well as a pre-tender estimate, you can get the post-tender estimate. Not as common, but it happens. A cost estimate carried out after the valuation of tenders to corroborate the funds required by the employer to complete the building project. The post-tender estimate should be prepared after the tender evaluation and any tender negotiations or tender adjustments have been completed, but before the final decision to invest is made by the client. The purpose of the post-tender estimate is to confirm the amount of funding that will be required in order to complete the project, allowing the client to satisfy themselves that sufficient funding will be available. It may also be used as a control estimate during the construction process. I may say at the moment these post-tender estimates are quite rare. But again, they could come up in the APC. So now, what happens when the tenders are returned? Tender opening procedures are usually, especially in the public sector, are very strict. The method for submitting tenders should clearly set out the instruction to tender documentation. It should include time, date, and location for tenders to be sent. It should also name the person that the tender return should be addressed to. Once the due date and time elapses, and no other tender return should be considered as part of the opening process. Late tenders should not be considered for public procurement projects. That's key. Private clients should be advised if tenders were late, and if they wish them still to be considered, then they must provide explicit instruction to do so. Yeah, as I was saying, the public sector are very strict to ensure that there's no sort of fraudulent activity. Tender opening procedures continued. A tender opening form should be used, and another qualified construction professional should be present to witness opening tenders. In some cases, if it's probably more if it's a private client, the tender is only opened by the private client's team. He may or may not invite a construction professional. Now, I have my own ideas about that. Sometimes it's because they would rather just keep the information to themselves, or just that's just how they do things. They want it to be confidential. Maybe don't want information to get out, so they keep it very close to their chest. Each tender should be opened and the general raw information noted on the tender opening form. That would typically include the tender price, which can be split into prelims, overheads, profit, prime cost, the proposed programme, any key comments or if there's any exclusions, if there's any alternative tender offers, and a confirmation that all documents have been submitted or not. It's very important this is done and kept on file. After the tenders have been opened, there's then a tender analysis. The review and analysis of submitted tenders must be carried out methodically and thoroughly to ensure parity for all tenders and to ensure tender returns are reviewed on a like-for-like basis. Now, obviously, the tender analysis should be a technical and a financial process. As a quantity surveyor, it's likely that you'll only be involved in the financial side of it. The technical will be passed over to the supervision consultant or the design consultant who will check that the technical aspects are all in order. The normalisation of the financial aspects of the tender returns is perhaps the most complex part of the tender analysis. It requires someone highly skilled and experienced in reviewing tender returns to properly analyse them. The number of methods and techniques at disposal of the quantity surveyor to normalise a tender: use an average of submitted costs, use the highest price from tender returns, or use a cost plan allowance for that particular element. Each method has its own advantages and disadvantages. There's no correct method, but the key is to be consistent. So basically, the QS team, under supervision of an experienced senior QS, will check all the calculations are correct. But then after that, they'll actually analyse probably on an elemental basis to see how closely it matches any pre-tender estimate. They'll check for consistency. If there's any big fluctuations between different tenderers for, say, the construction, for say the earthworks or the MEP, they'll try and investigate why there's a difference. It may be that one of the contractors misunderstood or missed some of the items out, haven't priced them properly. Rates or costs that seem unduly high or low should be highlighted. The tender analysis process is to ensure the right price is being paid for the proposed project. And the tender analysis team has a duty to make tenders aware of anything that seems to be an error. The pricing of the prelims and overhead and profits must also be equalised. In RICS NRM 1, order of cost estimating and cost planning for capital building works, and the NRM 2, detailed measurement for building works, identify the structure that tenders prelim should take. Provisional sums must be equalised. Day work rates should be analysed. Design and build contractors will include a risk allowance, which is acceptable within a certain range. And the profit and overhead should be shown as a percentage split. If the day work to be used in a project and the submit rate should be analysed, it's prudent to include a risk register in the tender documents as well, which clarify the risk which the contractor is expected to take forward and which risks remain with the client. This register can then be used to base a price risk allowances on and can be analysed and normalised in a similar fashion to the works cost. As an example, if the tender has excluded a key risk that other tenders are priced for, then this should be addressed and either excluded from all tenders with the client's agreement, or the tenderer has excluded it, should be given a chance to include a price for taking this particular risk. It's all about normalising the tenders. For overheads and profits, the contractor should split the percentage rate to show the amount for overheads and profits and the amount for profit. Any unreasonably low overhead and profits percentage can raise a valid query about how the contractor makes a profit on the project. For the convenience, the following checklist details other issues which should also form part of the tender analysis. Are insurances like for like in aggregate policies for each and every claim basis? The insurance certificates are provided for all insurance requested and at the levels included in the tender. You should check the renewal date for insurance policies and remember to set a reminder to ask for renewal certificates at the appropriate time. All qualifications and assumptions have been carefully reviewed, that they've been issued to the design team, project manager and the client for comment. The tender returns have all been issued to all members of the design team for comment. That the proposed subcontractors and suppliers have been checked for and comments retrieved from the design team. If necessary, he should request financial checks for any key subcontractors. If there's a price risk register included, that you should check they've been reviewed and all risks have been appropriately costed. How to deal with errors and qualifications. All tender returns should be checked for errors before any detailed analysis is undertaken. This will involve a full arithmetical check for the pricing side of the tender return and a logic check for the rest of the tender. And apart from obvious arithmetical errors, the key issues to be aware of are obvious errors in the programme date, any qualifications that make the tender null and void, and any conflicts of interest. And this can be done by reviewing the proposed key subcontractors. The GCT tendering practice note 2012, which is a UK document, it dictates a course of action if any arithmetical errors exist. The basic options are either one, you can allow the contractors to correct their error, or two, for the contractors to stand by their price. Now these can be, other countries use different methods. I can't deal with them all. You should make yourself familiar of the procedures in your particular country. If any other significant error or conflict is discovered, the contract must be made the contact must be made with the contractor as soon as possible to clarify the qualification or issue. If it cannot be resolved, then they must be made aware that they will be discounted from the tender process. If it can be resolved, i.e. if the conflict of interest can be dealt with by changing the proposed subcontractor, then the tenderer must confirm this in writing. The tender return should also be issued to all members of the design team for the feedback and input. Tender report. After the tender, after completion of the tender analysis, the QS or somebody will prepare the tender report. This should include a brief history of the tendering process, an analysis of each tender submission, and any subsequent negotiations. It's generally prepared by the cost consultant for submission to the client, but should have observations and contributions from the design team regarding the perceived value of each bid. Report should conclude with a clear recommendation as to the best value for money. If the tender process has any implications to the project or changes the position compared to the impression the client has been given pre-tender, then these should be clearly set out. The tender report provides an audit trail for the selection process and may include the following: in the background of the contract, scope of the contract, the pre-qualification criteria, the tender evaluation criteria, the reasons for rejection of unsuccessful tenders, the reason for recommendation, a summary of any post-tender negotiations, comparison with the pre-tender estimate, and any implications for the project. So we're now going to go into other forms of procurement that you may get asked about, and you certainly need to know about. Partnering. Now, partnering is on the rise in certain parts of the world, perhaps not in the Middle East, but I can see it happening in the future. So I'll give a brief explanation of the aspects of partnering here. It's not a procurement route in itself, and it can take different forms, but in this particular case, we're only concerned with single project partnering, where the parties agree to work on the principles of relationship for one project only. Partnering should be regarded as common sense and should be a starting point on which all relationships between parties should be based. It does not replace formal contracts or procedures between parties, but is a way of encouraging the finding of ways to deliver the project to the required quality that's within budget and within programme. A partnering charter is usually produced to be signed by all parties, which identifies common goals, sets out a procedure for solving problems and reaching decisions, and identifies the performance targets. It's vital that a project sponsor or the client representative should be appointed and is fully involved in the discussion leading to the agreement of the partnering charter to ensure that what is agreed takes into account the interests of the client as well as senior members of any construction firms involved in the project, so that they have the authority to make decisions which may affect their own interests. These participants should remain involved in the partnering procedure throughout the project to ensure that firms who may be introduced to the project are informed and aware of the basis of the partnering charter. If a partnering arrangement is to be successful, it requires all parties to buy into the concept. That is essential. If one party does not buy into it or loses faith, it will not work. It's not a bolt-on extra, but a continuous process that needs constant effort if it is to deliver. There are costs involved in partnering which arise from the additional time that the project sponsor or rep will have time to spend on the project, as well as possibly providing additional training for people such as decision-making and management techniques, but these costs will be offset by potential savings which can be made through the benefits of best practice. The advantages of partnering are the high levels of efficiency can be achieved, specialist teams can produce better designs, and disputes can be involved or diffused at an early stage. There are disadvantages in that the partnership concept can fail if any of the parties fail to uphold the agreement contained within the partnership chapter. It really depends if the team is going to trust each other, and they've got to be prepared to be open. If there's any issues, they've got to raise them early and then see how they can actually manage them and mitigate them early in the process before it becomes any sort of dispute. Now, I've run through the main points of tendering and procurement. That is the sort of key level of information you should know. At a very minimum, I would always recommend you do some extra reading, obviously. But what I'm going to do now is I've got a whole lot of sample type questions that you may get asked at RSS APC. Most of them we've already dealt with in this presentation, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through questions and a brief answer. So let's see if I get on with this. So I'll apologise if in some cases we're going over ground we've already covered, but there'll be certain other questions that you won't have heard before. Okay, procurement. What is procurement? Well, in a simple answer, it's the overall process of acquiring construction work or services. What should be considered when selecting a procurement route? The specifics of the project and the client objectives regarding cost, time, control, quality and risk. So that question could be couched in any sort of way, but basically this you say, you know, on the project you worked on, why did you use this particular procurement route? And then they would say, and what were the client objectives? So you should be able to list it for your own project. What are the main procurement methods? The four we dealt with in this in the presentation were traditional design and build, management contracting, and construction management. You could list others, especially if you've been involved in them personally. The whole thing about the APC is to use any knowledge that you've built up from your previous experience. That's always good. There's nothing like being able to relate to something that you've already done. What is additional procurement, if you're asked that? The design is completed by the client's design team before competitive tenders are invited, and a main contractor is employed to build what the designers have achieved. I'd say these are all sort of simple answers to these questions. How does traditional procurement work? The contractor takes responsibility and financial risk for the construction of the works to the design produced by the client's design team for the contract sum within the contract period. The client then takes responsibility and risk for the design and design team performance. And when might it be appropriate? It'll be appropriate if the employer has had the design prepared, if the design is substantially completed at the time of the contractor selection, if the client wishes to retain control over the design and specification, if cost certainty at the start of the programme at the start on site is important, and the shortest overall programme is not the client's main priority. What forms of contract might be used? Depends what part of the world you're in. There's usually a FIDIC contract to suit most types of procurement. There certainly is for traditional, and it's a red book or variants, but there is other ones that you may have used. You should always know 2 or 3, I would say, if you're going to get asked that in the APC. What are the advantages of traditional procurement? Well, there's competitive, fairness and transparent process, increased value for money. It's design-led, which can ensure quality. There's price certainty before commencement. There's well-known procedures. Everyone's aware of it. The contractor's aware of it, the design team, the client usually. And changes are reasonably easy to arrange and value. What are the disadvantages? Overall project duration may be longer than others. It's a sequential process. The next process can't start till the previous one is complete. There's no input into design or planning by the contractor. The strategy is based on price competition, which could lead to adversarial relations. There's a dual point of responsibility, the design team for the design and the contractor for the construction. If the design is not complete at the time of tender, cost and time certainty are reduced. So what is design and build? Design build is where the contractor is responsible for the design, the planning, the organisation, control and construction of the works to employers' requirements. How do design and build work? The employer gives tenderers the employer's requirements, and the contractors respond with the contractor's proposals, which include the price for the works. It's when might D&B be appropriate. The appropriate where there's a need for an early start on site, because you can overlap the design and construction. Where the client wishes to minimise their risk and not get responsibility for design, as I said, be very careful. In this part of the world, the client wants to transfer the risk, but also wants to keep control of design. That's not design and build. Be very careful. For technically complex projects, and you get the benefit of the contractor's expertise, and where the employer does not want to retain control over design development. Well, every client I've ever met always wants control over design development. What forms of contract might be used? Again, it depends what part of the world, but it's a FIDIC version. So what are the advantages of design and build? Single point responsibility for design and construction, earlier commencement on site, early price certainty, and the benefit of contractors' experience harnessed during the design. And what are the disadvantages of D&B? The client may find it hard to prepare a sufficiently comprehensive brief. He's going to need guidance from a consultant to help him to make sure that all the key points are tied down. The client has to commit to a concept design early. The variations from the original brief are difficult to arrange and can be very expensive. It's harder to compare the tenders because they're not quite like for like, as it would be traditional. They're hard to determine if they're getting value for money as a result. The ease of fabrication may be prioritised over aesthetic quality, and you may end up with a very functional looking building with no design flair. And there may be less real competition due to which you may have pure design and build firms who are capable of that particular design. For instance, if you're doing an airport hangar, maybe there's only limited contractors in the area that can do that. So it's not the same competition. How much design input will a contractor have? This depends on the amount of design work the employer already has completed at time of tender. From my experience, what usually happens is the employer's design team will do the concept design and the schematic design. And then that schematic design is then forwarded to the tendering contractors for them to develop the detailed design. And that's what usually happens. It could be done on schematic design, on concept design, but that will mean that there'll be more sort of range of completed designs. I would always recommend that that's also that's always designed on at least schematic design before it's issued. Who carries out the design for the contractor? Well, it can be outsourced to a separate design company, in which case the contractor retains responsibility, or they may have in-house design capability, or the client's team may be novated. That's quite common. So the client's team, which prepares the design up to schematic stage, is then taken on by the contractor. Which leads us on to what is novation. Novation is a new contract that transfers the rights and obligations of one contractual party onto a new third party, i.e. the design rights and obligations of an architect transferred to the contractor. Again, that's a question that's quite common at APC. You should always know what novation is. If the design team is novated, what should the client put in place? The client should put in a collateral warranty to the design team to give them remedies if there's a breach of contract. What is management contracting? As I've explained earlier, a management contractor is employed to contribute their expertise to design and to manage construction, and is paid a fee for doing so. How does management contracting work? If the management contractor has direct contractual links with all of the works contractors, they have the responsibility for the construction work without actually carrying them out. And not all of the design needs to be completed before the first works contractors are started. The management contractor selects the works contractors through competitive open book tenders. The client reimburses the cost of these packages to the management contractor plus their fee. And the management contractor's role is very low risk. He gets a prime cost plus a fee. When might it be appropriate? It might be appropriate where the client does not want cost certainty before commencement, and where an early, if early site start is the main priority, so fast track. What form of contract may be used? Again, it really depends on what part of the world you're in, and I would have a look to see what contracts are available. What are the advantages of management contracting? Well, the overall duration is shorter due to overlapping design and construction. And there's one contractor that contributes to the design and the planning process. Changes can be accompanied in packages not yet let if they have no further impact. The works are let competitively at current market prices on a firm price basis. What are the disadvantages of management contracting? If the price for the works is not received until the last package has been let, changes to the design of later packages may affect packages already let, so it can be expensive. If there's little incentive for the management contractor to reduce costs, it may become a post-box system that all he does is just basically receive the information and pass it on. In practice, the management contractor has very little legal responsibility for the defaults of the works contractors. Again, apologise, I'm going over old ground, but I think it's useful just to go through the brief answers to potential questions. What is construction management? And it's when an employer places a direct contract with each of the trade contractors and utilises the expertise of a construction manager who acts as a consultant to coordinate the contracts. How does it work? The trade contractors carry out the work. The construction manager supervises the construction process and coordinates the design team. The construction manager has no contractual links with the trade contractors or members of the design team. The role includes the preparation of the programme, determining requirements for site facilities, breaking down the project into suitable work packages, obtaining and evaluating tenders, and coordinating and supervising the works. Where might it be appropriate? It might be appropriate on large complex projects where the advantages of construction management can be put to use upfront, buildability knowledge, programme advice, specialist input from trade contractors. It might be appropriate where there's early start on site is key, where flexibility in design, procurement and construction strategy are required, where price certainty before commencement is not a key consideration, and where the client is experienced in construction. And what are the forms of contract? Again, I said before, just have a look to see what's available. What are the advantages? Overall construction duration is reduced by overlapping the design and construction. The construction manager can contribute to the design and the project planning process. The roles, risk and relationship for all parties are clear. The changes in design can be accommodated without paying a premium. Prices may be lower due to direct contracts with trade contractors, and the client has means of redress to trade contractors through direct contractual links. And the disadvantages: price certainty is not achieved until the last trade package is let. Changes to later packages may adversely affect packages that are already let, expensive. It needs an informed and proactive client, and the client has a lot of consultants and contractors to deal with, not just one, which means more fees. What's the difference between management contracting and construction management? That's a very good question. Under construction management, the client is in direct contractual relationships with each of the trade contractors, whereas a construction manager isn't. Under management contracting, the management contractor is in direct contractual relationship with the trade contractors, and the client is in contract with the with only the management contractor. Yeah, I would take great care of that one. Make sure you know the difference. It's not easy, and you get confused, I can assure you. How do you identify the client's requirements for recommending a procurement route? Again, this is a classic question to ask you about procurement in the exam. An answer could be that through detailed discussions with the client and design team to identify their priorities in terms of cost, time, quality, risk, control requirements, and experience. Like for instance, if it's a hotel project, what is important? Is it the number of rooms? Is it the quality of the rooms? Is it the size of the rooms? Is it how close to other facilities? All these questions, you know, the expected rate of return. So is it a 3-star? Is it a 5-star? Is it a resort? Does it have has it got a spa? All these questions. How quickly do they need it? You know, is cost key? Is time key? Is quality key? If a client wishes to start on site ASAP, what route would you recommend? Well, it depends on the other requirements, such as cost and quality. If time was our overriding priority, then construction management or management contracting are the quickest, as they offer the fastest start on site. This is because start on site is not dependent on a long tender period, but there is consequential disadvantages which I've dealt with earlier in terms of cost certainty. So that should all be considered. So what if the client wanted an early start but also cost certainty? Well, design and build might be the most appropriate, because it allows design and construction to be overlapped rather than being sequential, so it's faster than traditional. Tenders are based on the provision of all services, so the client gets a lump sum price, which he doesn't get with construction management or management contracting. So you've got to consider all aspects. You know, there's not usually one answer that you got to be able to talk about it, basically. What is GMP? If you're asked what is GMP, guaranteed maximum price. Just a general advice, if you're asked a question in EPC, only answer the question, don't elaborate too much because you go off track. Answer the question clearly and concisely. The examiner may ask another question that follows on from that, and that's fine. You answer that. He will ask you questions until he is satisfied that you know what you're talking about. If he stops asking questions on the subject, that's fine. That means that he's happy. If he asks you 10 questions on the same subject, that means that he's not convinced that you know. So he's trying to tease more information. Keep it clear and concise, and you won't go wrong. Sorry, so back to GMP. That's what does GMP mean to you, if you're asked that? Well, it's a lump sum contract under which there is no adjustment of tender prices unless the scope required by the client changes. The contractor includes additional risks involved in the design development process in this tender price. And what are the advantages of GMP? There's greater price certainty. The contractor takes the risk of design development and unforeseen occurrences. There's a greater control of overspending. The contractor's interest to alert the team to expensive items of design development, and quicker settlement of final account. What are the disadvantages of GMP? The client may pay too much. The contractor's risk allowance may be higher than in reality. Scope changes are likely to be very expensive, and it can be adversarial, trying to decide whether changes are design development or scope changes. Now, this is something that I haven't dealt with in the presentation, but is becoming more and more common in all parts of the world. It's coming to the Middle East. What is PPI? What is PFI or PPP, as it's more commonly known? It's basically it's a private financial initiative or public partnering, public-private partnership. It was launched in the UK in 1992 to bring private sector project management and expertise into the public sector. The private sector is granted a concession to finance, design, build, and operate a major public project such as a school or a hospital. There's different types of PFI projects. Three main ones. Sorry, I'm going too quickly there. The three main types are financially freestanding and project undertaken with costs recovered by charging users, either like a toll road or a bridge. There's a joint venture public and private sector project where the public and the private sector contribute, but the private sector has overall control. Contributions and allocation of risk are clearly defined. Or there's the services sold, which is a significant part of the project, is capital expenditure by the private sector and then sold back to the public sector. The public sector requires demonstration that this provides better value for money than other options. So what is the potential role of a cost consultant in a PFI or PPP scheme? Well, you can either act for the contractor, providing advice like you normally give to a client. For instance, you could provide a bill of quantities for the contractor based on his design, or you could provide cost advice, or you could become part of the special purpose vehicle, which is the public sector group, and act as the end user representative. So there's different inroads for the QS to get involved in PFI, PPP. What sort of projects might PFI be used on? Well, it's used as recommended where it offers clear value for money. Now, certain parts of the world, for instance, UK, it's generally been regarded as not value for money. It's almost like a mortgage, in that the private sector builds something and then leases it back to the private sector back to public sector for say 25 years, like a school. And if you add up the figures at the end of 25 years, far more expensive than it would have been to build and maintain themselves. But it's used because the public sector may not have the money in their budgets to build it up front. So it's like a mortgage for a house. Costs a lot in the long run. It's generally considered more important for larger projects, greater than, well, there's no particular sum, but there's a significant ongoing maintenance requirement. It's commonly used in schools and hospitals. What might the problems be associated with PFI, PPP? Well, there's high bidding costs. It takes longer to procure than in the normal projects. Value for money, not really. Design could be an issue. The relationship between the PFI client and the contractor. The government often tries to maintain close control, but the leader is the contractor. It's his project. And concession agreements. Now, it's unlikely you're going to get asked a huge amount of question about PPP, but it is good to have an overall knowledge of it. I'm going to run through some more advanced questions. It probably won't come up, but you never know. So what is build lease transfer? Now, these are different forms of PPP. So this is build lease transfer, which could be called BLT. This is when a facility is designed, financed and constructed by the private sector and then leased back to the government for a predetermined period of time at a pre-agreed rental. The facility is owned by the private sector partner during the lease period. And at the end of the period, say 25 years, the government can either renew the lease, buy out the private sector partner, or walk away from the deal. The operation and maintenance of the facility during the lease period is usually the government's responsibility. This provides the government with a way of financing large-scale infrastructure and ongoing revenue rather than capital expenditure. The primary advantage is that legal ownership remains with the private sector. What is build, operate, transfer? I realise these terms are confusing, but this is when a facility is designed, financed, operated and maintained by a concession company for the period of the concession. Ownership of the facility is vested in the host government from time of construction to completion. At the end of the period, the concessionaire's involvement of the project ends and all operating rights and maintenance responsibilities revert back to the government. The concessionaire retains all income during the agreed period. This could be like a bridge. So over the period, which could be 25 years, the concessionaire keeps all the toll money for the first 25 years. then after that hands it back to the government. What is build, own, operate transfer? A variation on the build, operate transfer where ownership stays with concessionaires until the end of the concession period and is then transferred free of charge to the host government. So I've touched on PFI, PPP there. I don't think they'll ask many questions, but they could. It's always worth having an overall, having a sort of general knowledge of the PPP system. Then we're going to go into partnering that I spoke about in the presentation. It's what is partnering. It's a different way of structuring a business relationship. It involves two or more organisations working together to achieve specific mutual objectives and deliver continuous measurable improvement. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's what it is. So what is project partnering? The project partnering is when all members of the professional team become involved in the partnering process at the design stage. That includes contractors, which is unusual. Ownership of risk is spread between the parties and a collaborative approach is encouraged to deliver the solution and overcome problems. Okay, that's project partnering. So what is strategic partnering? That is a long-term relationship for a number of projects or works that will last over a long period. Framework agreements allow this and are implemented on a project-by-project basis. So basically, the partnering team signs up to delivering, could be like 10 schools, for instance, rather than one school, they could deliver 10 schools on a rolling period. The framework agreement is when an agreement between the contractor, suppliers, and the employer. It provides an agreement to fix the terms and conditions for future projects, subject to inflation agreements. So it's a long-term strategic partnership, basically. That's what it says. So what are the key characteristics of partnering? There's more trust involved between the parties. There's extra incentives, potentially, for regular work, impacts on prices, conflict disputes, etc. Administrative burden is increased and it therefore restricts it to larger projects. Yeah, there's not much point partnering on, say, building a house. There's got to be building either one single project or, let's say, like a program of schools or something such like. Key question, what are the benefits of partnering? Well, the overall construction and design program is shortened because there's a prior understanding of the client and the requirements from previous projects. Also, if you can build up relationships between the team, you all start to know each other, so you know how they work, you know who to pick up the phone and speak to. Conflict is reduced. There's improved communication and mutual objectives. There's a pooling of resources and ideas that should result in innovative solutions. Improved customer satisfaction. There's better value for the client. There's recognition of protection of profit margin for contractors and suppliers. There's an environment that encourages innovation and technical development. There's improved buildability, early involvement of contractors. There's better predictability of time and cost, and there's stability and better confidence amongst the team. So, which contracts can be used for partnering? Well, again, depends where you are, but it's PPC 2000. It's for this, in which case the key stakeholders of the project, the client, the contractor, the consultants, and the key specialists sign only a single integrated contract. There's NEC 3, option X12, which is a partnering contract, but does not create a multi-party contract. It's only for a single contract. There's a JCT framework agreement, and there's the NEC 3 framework agreement. So that's 4 examples. On to another question which wasn't really dealt with in the presentation, but it could be asked. What is a key performance indicator, KPI? Well, it's to enable all those involved in the construction supply chain to establish how they're performing on a project. Allows organisations to benchmark their performance in those areas that are critical to the success of the projects. And there's nationally recognised KPIs, so you can measure and compare yourself against them. Now, these are very popular. Well, I don't know if they're popular, but they're widely used by government clients to basically score a consultant or a contractor, and they can also hold money from the contractor. It's like an incentive scheme, or it's like a penalty scheme, more like if you're judged not to be sort of reaching the correct KPI figure, you could get money withheld. So it's something like a stick to beat you with, but yeah, there we go. Another general question that wasn't specifically mentioned, what is an integrated supply chain? Well, an integrated supply chain has the objective of understanding and working wholly in the interest of the project client rather than the immediate client. And what advantages can an integrated supply chain bring? Well, it can reduce costs but maintain margins. It's an incentive to remove waste and inefficiency. It gives greater certainty of outturn costs. It gives better underlying value to the client. It gives the opportunity of more repeat business with key clients, and it gives better confidence for longer term planning. Therefore, the project client gets more responsive industry delivering facilities that better meet the user needs and are delivered in time and cost of minimum defects, and it creates higher customer satisfaction. So that was 56 questions on procurement. I'm now going to go through some tendering questions and answers. I would say basically all these questions, it's a type of headings that you should know about. So even if you don't, well, if you want to go a bit further and do a bit further reading on these, I'd always recommend that. I'm giving basic answers, but there's no harm in reading any of these headings. So what is tendering? Tendering is a method of obtaining the resources necessary to carry out required work. It's a simple answer. What are the main methods of choosing a contractor? Well, there's open tendering, there's selective tendering, which can be single or two-stage. There's nomination or negotiation. There's serial tendering, and there's joint ventures. That's the 5 main types, I would say. If you can list these 5, you're asked, that should, that's fine. Then they may go on to ask, what is open tendering? Well, open tendering is an indiscriminate request for tenders. It could be like an advert in a paper, if tender is wanted for, contract. An advert placed in a local paper inviting contractors. It will give the characteristics for the work, and it usually requires a deposit to be placed to discourage this is time wasters, basically. What are the advantages of open tendering? It means that there's no favouritism. You're not just going to your pet contractors. You're opening out to the open market to some people that you may not be aware of even exist. It gives opportunities for capable firms you not have put on a list, and it should secure the maximum benefit from the competition. What are the disadvantages of open tendering? Well, there's a danger that the lowest tender is inexperienced or has made a lot of errors. There's no guarantee that the lowest is capable or even financially stable. And the total cost of tendering is increased because you might have 20 or 30 tenderers, each one of which has a financial outlay. What is selective tendering? Selective tendering restricts the number of tenders by pre-selecting a limited number of contractors to tender for the work. What are the 2 types of selective tendering? Well, a single stage and 2-stage. So then that will lead on to, so what is single stage tendering? It's a structured process of receiving competitive tenders from a number of pre-selected capable contractors who provide a lump sum for the works. Contractors are pre-selected on a basis like established skill, integrity, responsibility, proven competence and character, size of work. I would recommend that it should be no more 6 on a list. I would say 5 is a good number. If pre-selection is done beforehand, then tenders can be selected on price alone. Good contractors have the following: in recent experience, the necessary skills, good management and organisational structure, spare capacity and good financial standing. So that's what you're looking for your first stage. What are the advantages of single stage tendering? Well, it ensures that only capable and approved firms submit tenders. It tends to reduce the aggregate cost of tendering. What we spoke about earlier, that there's not much point having 30 people all going for the same job. That's just a waste of everyone's time. And the client gets a lump sum for the whole works. So, what is two-stage tendering? It separates the process involved with selecting a contractor from the processes for determining the price of the works. It is used when it is desired to obtain the benefits of competition and have the advantage of bringing a contractor into the planning of a project and gain an early commencement. So what is the purpose of the first stage of two-stage tendering? To select a suitable contractor by means of limited competition. What is the purpose of the, sorry, that should read the second stage, sorry. The purpose of the second stage is a negotiation process of selected contractor on the basis of the first stage. So what do the tenders return as part of the first stage? They'll provide a detailed build-up of prices for the prelims. They'll give percentage additions for profit and overheads. They'll give a construction programme and a proposed subletting of the works. So basically, they're given high-level cost information, the programme, which is very important, and also how they propose to structure the project. So is there any precaution you should take before entering into second stage? Define the procedure for either party to withdraw should second stage negotiation prove abortive, and that should be done before payments become due. Yeah, so you should basically set out all the procedures, so you can sort of bow out at any stage if you have to. What are the advantages of two-stage tendering? As well as the early involvement of the contractor. It encourages collaborative working. There's potential for earlier start date, greater client involvement in selecting the supply chain, and the contractor can help identify and manage risk. What are the disadvantages of two-stage tendering? Well, the cost certainty may not be achieved before construction starts. Additional pre-construction fees for the contractor. The contractor should take advantage of the second stage negotiation and could increase the costs. And there's a potential for parties to not agree on the contract sum, which could result in a re-tender exercise, which is expensive and time consuming. So when should you use two-stage tendering? You should use it if the building's complex. You should use it if the magnitude of work is unknown at the time of contractor selection. You should use it if early completion is required, and you should use it if the design team would like to make use of the contractor's expertise on buildability issues. So it could be of a very specialist nature, and you want the expertise of a particular contractor. So what is negotiation or nomination? This is where the client has got a preference for a particular firm and wants to enter into direct negotiation or to nominate them direct. So when might this be used? It may be used when the contractor has done satisfactory work for the client in the past. He wants to use them again. He wants to give them opportunity. So how does it work? Well, there's no competition, so that might lead to a higher price, but the client may think it's worth it for a quicker and better quality job. The contract sum is arrived at by a process of negotiation. One party usually prices the schedule of rates in a bill, which is used as the basis. What is serial tendering? It's effectively strategic partnering. The contractors are asked to bid for a project on the basis that if the build is won satisfactorily, others of a similar type will follow, and the same bill rates will be used. So there's an incentive there to all round to, for the repeat business. What is a framework agreement? It's for a list of contractors selected by the client after a formal tendering procedure to work over a long period of time. The contractor may have to wait his turn for a contract or tender repeatedly with the same group of contractors. It's usually like a call-off agreement. There's, as I just said, there's maybe 10 or so contractors who are on a list, and the client can either pick on them. They've already been pre-selected on the quality and price, and then there may be a mini tender for future projects, or they may just call them off as a one at a time as the projects come up. What is a joint venture? A joint venture is usually used on large complex projects where 2 or more companies take on a joint and several liability for design and execution of the project. Now, this is quite common in the Middle East, where a local contractor will get involved with a major international contractor. Onto the tendering procedure. What information would the instruction to tender contain? Well, as I explained earlier, commonly the date for return, the address to return to, site visit details, programme length, confirmation of receipt of documents, and instructions on how the tender should be submitted. What is a form of tender? Form of tender is a pre-printed formal statement in which the tenderer fills in the blank spaces. He provides his name and address and the sum of money for which he offers to carry out the works. What are employers' requirements? Usually using design and build, it sets out the client's requirements, i.e. the function, the size, accommodation, and the quality. It gives a level of detail, which depends on how much design has been done prior to the tender. Normally includes a current state of planning permission, and it should detail a level of design, the structure and specification information to be provided by the tenderers. And what are the contractor's proposals? Well, these are the contractor's response to the employer's requirements. They're the key document for the client to consider at the tender review. Often includes plans, elevations, sections, and typical details. Layout drawings and specification for materials and workmanship are also included. How do you decide which contractors to go to? Well, the preliminary inquiry is based on design team recommendations. You would issue a pre-qualification questionnaire to interested and suitable contractors, and then based on these responses, a decision can be made to go out to a reasonable number of tenders, taking into account financial situation, the relevant experience, and the health and safety records. What is a preliminary inquiry letter? What should it include? Approximately 1 month before tendering, you can send out a tender inquiry letter to ascertain whether firms are willing to submit a bona fide tender. Sufficient info is then given to the contractor to allow them to make a decision. You should inform them of other requirements, like whether there's bonds required, stuff like that. What would you include in a pre-qualification questionnaire? Well, you would include the details of the contract particulars in accordance with Practice Note 6 of the JCT guidance. Turnover, previous relevant experience and references, company accounts, personnel information, management and organisational structure, health and safety records, quality systems and environmental policy, and the provision of bonds and warranties. This is done through the questionnaire interview process, and we'll have a scoring matrix that should be explained. A question could come up, what is electronic tendering? Well, basically it's when all the forms, documents and drawings are uploaded onto a server. Tenders are provided all necessary information to access and download this information, and safeguards are built in to prevent unauthorised amendment of the data. So there must be a clear system of notifying parties if there's any changes to the tender information. They may ask, do you know of any tendering services? Well, for a start, RSAS has one, but nowadays most big clients will work on this basis. If you've had any experience, you should bring that into your question and answer. What are the advantages of e-tendering? Well, it may be possible to reduce the tender period because of the rapid transmittal of documents. There's reduced copying and mailing costs. You can respond faster to email inquiries. There's a more efficient estimating process because it's easier to break down and transmit to the subcontractors. Software can be used to quickly analyse the bids, and it maintains an audit trail of all communication. What is online bidding? Well, tenders can view and download the tender information online. The bidding process commences at a specific time. The client sets an opening price and tenders complete under bidding. Tenders can submit as many bids as they like until the closing time. It's common that if a new bid is submitted within 30 minutes of closing time, it is extended to allow other tenders to respond. If the tender is awarded on price alone, the lowest tender gets immediate feedback. It's almost like an online auction, really. It's like, yeah. How many contractors would you include on a tender list? Well, it depends on the size of the project. I would say because the cost of tendering is high, it's common to limit to 4, 5 or 6, I would say, depending on the project. That provides cover if one drops out. That provides better relationships with contractors and improves the likelihood of competitive tenders because they know there's a reasonable chance of getting a job from the outset. I mean, if it's a major project, there's a lot of expense for the contractor to put a bid together. If they think there's 20 other competitors, it's, you know, the odds of them winning are so low that they may not actually provide a tender. How would you determine the duration of the tender period? Well, it depends on the procurement process and the size of the project. If traditional, the BQ, at least a month is required to obtain information on subcontractors. But for a large complex scheme, it'll be longer. If it's the first stage of a 2-stage, it may be 2-3 weeks, as though they need the prelim information. If it's D and B, well, it really depends on the size of the project. If it's a small project, 6 to 8 weeks for the design to be done, but for a major project, it can be substantially more than that. If you think the contractor's got to get a design team on board and then develop the design to detailed stage and then price it, it could be months. So it really depends on the size of the project and the complexity of the project. It's better to give enough time to ensure contractors can price it correctly rather than rush it, because then you get the contractors will price risk, which will be more expensive. So when seeking tenders for construction work in addition to that of fee bid, what information would clients typically expect to be submitted? Well, I've said it before, you want the track record of the previous experience of the contractor, the information on the proposed team, CVs or team profiles, their methodology or approach, references, and the programme. You may get asked, how did you decide the number of tenders on your project? You know, this could be on your critical analysis or your in your APC. You know, if you talked about a particular project, they may ask you these questions. You know, how did you decide the number of tenders? Well, you'd have to answer based on your project. But for instance, if it was design and build, there's less tenders due to cost and time implications. The contractor would like to think there's a good chance. But for traditional, you would hopefully say 4, 5, 6 maximum as a balance between competition and contractor care. I would recommend you don't say you went to 20 contractors, because then they'll ask you why. Make it easy. How does a contractor price day works in their tenders? Well, the QS will have included a lump sum for a particular day work item. The contractor then adds an uplift, a percentage uplift, gives the total for the section. So the competition is therefore based on the percentage uplift. You may get asked why, as a QS, you examine tenders, but you check the tender has included everything, to say they're still, if a contractor is the lowest, you want to make sure they've included everything. The component parts of the tender shall be used subsequently for varying variations. So if there's errors in the schedule of rates or a BQ, you need to identify them at tender analysis stage and deal with them. It's just, going to be using the bill of quantities all through the contract. It's what should be examined and look for in a tender. Well, you should be looking for arithmetical errors. You should be looking for pricing errors. That item is not priced, or the same item at different prices in different sections. You want to check the pricing methods, whether it's front loading or back loading, or if there's qualifications to the tender. What is the procedure after the submission date and time has passed for tender returns? Well, there's a formal procedure to eliminate suspicion of irregularities. No tender opened before the submission deadline. Tenders are supplied with a return envelope to prevent accidental opening. Tenders should be opened relatively soon after the deadline is passed, and possibly other parties present as witnesses. What happens if a tender is delivered late? Well, the safest option is not to consider it. Just leave it, as then you're open to accusations of fraud or collusion or bid rigging. It's just not worth it. If a private client wishes to open it, that is at their discretion. But as a professional consultant, you should advise them of the dangers. If it's a public client, a late tender, it just cannot be accepted. It just can't. Even if it's a few minutes late, a judgment call is needed, but I would always say don't open. If it's late, you just don't open it. Simple as that. If you do start accepting late tenders, it sets a standard that you don't want. It means that contractors in future may also not keep the deadlines. You've got to stick to it. How do you evaluate a contractor's proposal for D&B? Well, the first thing is not solely on price. Very important. Price isn't everything. You've got to check the programme, the design, the contractor's proposal, the materials that they want to use, the method statements, and employees all have to be assessed. You want to check for discrepancies from the employer's requirements, and it's easier if the design has already been progressed by the client prior to tender. Every design will be different, so you need to consider that. What criteria should be considered if not on price alone? Well, just explained it above, but basically the approach, like the method statement in the programme, customer care, how they're going to liaise with the employer, environmental considerations like noise, sort of nuisance reduction, health and safety management, the resources available, the supply chain, and the design aesthetics, and flexibility in use and life cycle cost even should all be considered. So you may get asked, what would you do if the lowest tender also has a lowest quality specification? Well, as a professional, you should spell out the implications to the client, and you should say that there's higher maintenance costs potentially. But ultimately, it's the client's decision. All you can do is advise. What is the danger of accepting a very low tender? Well, they may have missed out something, obviously. The quality may be lower than some of the other tenders. Once on site, they may try to recover their costs by a large number of variations or claims for extension of time or loss in expense, and it could end up in dispute. What happens if tenders? What happens if tenders returned on a higher than a pre-tender estimate? Well, that could be market problems, and you need to reconcile and identify major differences. It could be value engineering is required to take place on these elements. Just a few more questions, then we're finished. How would you deal with errors in tender returns? Well, it depends on which alternative has been chosen on the instructions to tenders. Alternative one could be that the QS should amend computing errors, which should arrive at a new tender sum. They should inform the contractor, who can then choose to confirm or withdraw their tender. Alternative two, the QS should amend computing errors, which should arrive at a new tender sum. They should inform the contractor, who can then choose to confirm, amend, or withdraw. So you may get asked, what would you do in a traditional procurement route if the tender returned an alternative tender with a different method of construction? Well, assuming you'd asked them to supply an alternative tender, you'd assess it along with others and liaise with the client. If you didn't ask for an alternative tender, you should demand a compliant tender. How do you deal with qualifications within the tender? It should be outlined when you go out to tender in the instructions. If there are unauthorised qualifications, it might invalidate the tender and lead to disqualification. It is possible to authorise a qualification if the tender has raised if it's raised a query of the QS, in which case all other tenders should have been notified and instructed as what to do. What would you do if the lowest tender submitted no pricing or prelims? Would you recommend he was accepted? Well, it depends on the form that the tender was sent out in and the instruction to tenderers. It's usual to have the prelims split into the method and time-related items. If they did not break them down as required, it is officially a non-compliant tender. But in practice, the contractor is usually provided with opportunities to provide a full breakdown within a couple of days, and this will be regarded as valid. But they're not allowed to change the figures. They're not allowed to gain an advantage. The fact that this was done should be noted in the tender report. What would you do if you considered the contractor submitting the lowest tender to be in financial difficulty? Well, as part of the valuation of tenders, you would look to the company accounts. If this hadn't been already done at pre-qualification stage, you'd also request references from previous employers for work recently done. See if you can find out if contractors were paid on time, and ensure the contractor can provide a bond and is all in place before commencing. So the contractor's bond is the key there. On what grounds would you advise a client to retender? Well, personally, if not enough tenders had returned tenders, if the tendering procedure is believed to be compromised for some reason, if tenderers were not at the cost level required and it believed that retendering to different tenders would provide a different result, or if design changes or value engineering have been carried out that will significantly change the design that was originally tendered on. How would you deal with a front-loaded BQ? Well, this is not a pricing error. Removing the front loading would not reduce the tender price. You can ask the contractor to adjust his pricing to remove it during the analysis. The QS should ensure that all items are consistently priced throughout the document. It has implications on valuing variations later and may be a sign that the contractor has financial difficulties. How do you carry out a tender evaluation? You need a breakdown of the tenders, check them to ensure they've been priced in accordance, that there are no errors, qualifications or exclusions. You follow any procedures if errors are found. You compare against the pre-tender estimate to check rates are not unusually high or low. You ensure all amendments made during the tender period have been incorporated, and you prepare a tender report giving a summary of the actions, costs and recommendations. Finally, number 57, what should be included within the tender report? It should include a list of tenders received, initial tender return totals, any qualifications identified, post-tender adjustments, revised tender sum, issues to be resolved, comparison of tender returns, and a comparison with the pre-tender estimate. So I'm afraid I've overrun my time there. What I'd suggest is, if you have any questions, if you can log them with on the MEQSA site, and I'll try and get back to over the next couple of days. I can also possibly make the answers to these questions available, which may help, but my main advice is read up on all these headings. These are topics that will probably come up in an APC exam. So, okay, thank you for that.